In today's video, we're going to be talking about the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Um, the Bill of Rights were introduced after the Constitution was ratified, and it was very important to many Americans like George Mason, who actually did not support the Constitution. They believed that it was made the government too powerful, but most important, there was no protection of people's individual rights. There was nothing mentioned about it. And so he did not, he wouldn't sign unless there was something in there about that. But James Madison assured them that the first thing they do, if we can get this ratified, the first thing that they would do is put up all his amendments in the first session of Congress so that they can decide what to do about these personal rights. It wasn't enough for him, but he was a pretty smart guy. What you should know about him, his Virginia Declaration of Rights inspired Jefferson when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. So, the Declaration of Independence is partially based on Virginia Declaration of Rights by George Mason. Okay, so this is a very smart, important person, very loud voice in the Revolution. He and Patrick Henry um, said that they did not want it ratified by Virginia. Um, and he was also against the slave trade. But the important things is that, as promised, James Madison in 1789, very first session of the new Congress, uh, offered the 12 amendments, presented 12 amendments for the Constitution, and they ratified 10, and we know this as the Bill of Rights. Now, before we continue, amendments are an addition or a change to a document. So that's what when we say that these amendments, these are changes, and that's one great thing about the Constitution is that it has a mechanism so that if we ever feel that the Constitution is wrong or out of date or whatever, we don't have to start over. We can just amend it. We can add or change something that's in there. There is a process to do this. So the first 10 amendments to the Constitution are known as the Bill of Rights, and they are based on George Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights and Thomas Jefferson's Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. That's something that's probably going to be on the test. You should know this. Virginia Declaration of Rights and Thomas Jefferson's Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. So definitely know those two documents. What's interesting about it is that we think of Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence, but here it's the opposite. When we're talking about these other documents, George Mason is the Declaration of Rights, Virginia Declaration of Rights, and Thomas Jefferson was about religious freedom, and he wrote the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. So it's kind of the opposite of the way that we remember it. Just when we see these other documents that are not the Declaration of Independence, just kind of reverse it in your mind and know that the Declaration one goes to George Mason. Okay, I'm not going to get too deep into it like I will in class, but when you look over these rights, like the First Amendment is about freedom of speech and religion, Second Amendment is about owning guns, Third Amendment is, you can't be forced to house soldiers. As you go through them, you can see that these are lessons that the Americans learned through the Revolution, that these were things that they did not like or felt were necessary for the success of the revolution. For instance, not in order to have an open and free government, you have to be able to say what you want to say and pray the way you want to pray. This is something that the government cannot touch. They made it very clear. These are, the religion more is an aspect of why we came here in the first place. A lot of the colonists were very religious, and we covered that in chapter 4. As far as the weapons, without Americans owning their own personal weapons, there's no way we could have fought off the British Empire, the greatest military in the world at the time. So they recognize this, and I make the point that when we're talking about the Second Amendment, the perspective that the founding fathers had, they weren't talking about hunting or even personal protection against a robber or something. That was just uh, that's just common sense. But the reason why they felt that it was necessary to put it, remember, these are restrictions against the government. The government cannot mess with these things. So it is directed uh, pretty much solely at our own government. People try to say it's about hunting or self-defense or against a foreign power, and that's not why the Second Amendment is here. It is here to protect us from our own government if it ever goes rogue on us. So that's why the Second Amendment is there. And then, you know, they were forced to house and feed soldiers, around in the Revolutionary time. Um, they did not, they were searched in their houses. They were tried in Britain. They moved trials to Britain, so if you had to answer a charge, you can't bring witnesses. So all these things about, a fair and speedy trial. You can't have a secret trial. You can't be tortured or treated badly. These are all things that we learned during the revolution that we can't let these things happen. This is something that you get fearful of if your government turns against you. So these were things that were just spelled out. And of course, at the end, the last two, they make it very clear that the Constitution does not list all the rights of the people. You can keep adding more if you think it's necessary, and that the federal government is limited. This was something that probably would have made George Mason much happier, that it has limits on its powers, and anything that's not explicitly in the Constitution falls to the states, something I think we ignore a little bit today. Um, and then finally, in this page here, they talk about the slave trade. And George Mason was against the slave trade, even though he was for the ownership of slaves. Um, what ended up happening was they allowed the trade to go on for another 20 years, and that slavery would continue to exist in America. So that effort, just like the Three-Fifths Clause, was a failure and continued the practice of slavery here in America, which was very unfortunate. Oh, one thing I wanted to mention in the last, um, let's see, the last lesson, I'm not sure I put it in there, um, but 9 of 13 states were needed to ratify the Constitution, or well, they needed to ratify it in 9 of 13 states before it could go into effect. Let me be clear. So they would ratify the Constitution, and once they got 9 states out of the 13, then the Constitution would be the law of the land. So they were able to do that, and that's why we have in 1789 the first session of Congress. They introduce right here. They introduced the Bill of Rights. Okay. Thanks for joining me, and I hope that helps. Thank you.